Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Brett Raina-Nackman. I'm with College Autism Network. Glad to see all of you here for our October 2020 Canvas meeting. Sound like a broken record, but we want to make sure audio quality is as good as possible for everybody. So a reminder to please make sure your microphones are muted. Feel free to use your video feeds if you'd like. Contribute to the chat as you would like throughout the meeting. And you all should have access to our meeting agenda. I'm going to pop it into the chat once again, just to make sure that everybody knows what our lineup is for today. We're really glad to be bringing on Dr. Julie Lounds Taylor at Vanderbilt University, who's going to be talking about her work as an editor for the Autism Journal. We'll get into that in just a few minutes, but first, as I said, a warm welcome. We know many of you are returning Canvas community members. Some of you, this may be your first time, so just kind of a quick overview. We have these monthly meetings as an opportunity for community gathering, where we have a featured guest presenter, some updates from all of us at College Autism Network, and also using this as an exchange of resources, ideas, and supports. And along those lines, you may be familiar with our listserv, which we've seen a lot of activity recently, which is great as it pertains to people asking for advice on programs they run, or even disseminating word about research studies that folks are conducting. So continue to utilize it. It's a really great hub in many ways. Also, as you know, we have our College Autism Programs list, and we certainly welcome further contributions and recommendations for enhancing it as we revise it moving forward. Perhaps the biggest thing coming from all of us at College Autism Network and the NASPA organization, in which we are a part of, is the College Autism Summit, which starts up in less than 2 weeks. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lee Williams.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, 2 weeks. Every time I hear somebody on the news say that, you know, the election is only 3 weeks away, or however long it's been, I always hear that and subtract a week and think, well, the summit's even closer. Not as critical on a national or international scale, but certainly important. We've got about 250 people that have already registered for the summit, and we've got another 2 weeks in which you can register if you haven't already. We've got an amazing group of recorded content, live content, great plenary speakers, panels, summit working groups, which is our version of speed dating, and hopefully a lot of fun. I see a number of familiar names on the screen here that I know will be attending or presenting, and so we look forward to seeing you there. And I know Brett put the link in the agenda. I'll drop it right here in the chat. And if anybody has any questions, send me a note. October 27th to 30th, sorry.
Great, thank you, Lee. Yeah, it's going to be a very robust set of programming, and I know many of us are walking all of our time during those days toward the summit because there's going to be a lot in store. So thank you for that. Also, too, one of the exciting things that has descended from many wonderful contributors in our Canvas community is an Autism Universal Design training that is being utilized in many different institutions, and many key folks in that space are on the call, and I believe TC might have some updates or thoughts to share toward that end.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So many of you know, and I know that Brett was saying that there are new participants today, so I'll just whistle-stop tour you through this. There have been 16 plus researchers that we've been working together to develop and evaluate our Autism and Universal Design training for faculty. So that's a study that we've been working on cross-institutionally from the States and Canada, the UK, Australia, different places. A lot of the people who we work with are here today. And that's this study is being done under the leadership of Dr. Kristen Gillespie Lynch. So just quickly, we designed this using participatory methods with many autistic individual researchers, such as myself. And we launched about 3 weeks ago or so, and I'm so happy to say that we've had a great response, participant-wise. It's been wonderful. We are still taking people on the wait list because, as you know, circumstances change and people who sign up might not be able to complete it. So if you are a faculty or TA teaching in a college or university right now this semester, and you want to learn more about autism and you want to gain some skills and some tools for universal design training for both real-time and online courses, please sign up for our study, get on our wait list. We have tons of resources for you, and I'll pop the website in the chat, and it's got information, and you can email me directly with any questions or if you want more information. So we're very excited, and thanks everybody who's participating right now. We really appreciate you, and we'll have more updates later.
Thank you, TC. And I know everybody is loving your background and your skeleton joining you. As you can all see, your skeleton friend on the screen right there.
Well, Brett, I added the little skeleton dog just for you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think all of us are always envious of that cool chair in the background as well. I think as TC was sharing, what's so beautiful about the training and this whole endeavor is just the idea of collaboration and so many folks working together. Like, this wouldn't have been possible without so many individuals working on this over the course of many, many months. So it's really nice to see this coming to fruition. So we're thankful to everybody who's a part of that and may want to further disseminate it and utilize it. At this point, what we've been trying to do with our meetings is really try to have a more explicit interactive portion beyond the notion of, if you want to put things in the chat, that is great, and we welcome that. We also want to make sure that folks are utilizing these these monthly meetings as a space for sharing resources. So you'll see on our meeting agenda, we have an opportunity, if you'd like to talk a little bit about an article, resource, video, anything interesting you've come across recently as it pertains to autism and post-secondary education. If you want to drop things in the chat, you can do that too, and we will curate that. But we want to give folks space toward discussing things that they've come across and maybe informing others about that. One thing that I'll kind of kick us off, and please feel free to contribute to the chat or the agenda. One thing that you may have come across that got a lot of national attention recently actually was on 60 Minutes. There was a segment by Anderson Cooper about autistic individuals transitioning to the workforce and employment opportunities. And we saw many familiar faces from our Canvas community as part of that segment out at the Frisk Center and others throughout the country as well. So that was a really nice spotlight and representation there. So if you haven't checked out the clip yet, it is available on YouTube. But it was really good to see some familiar faces there. And it looks like Brad Cox is next up to share some different resources too. But again,
Sure.
As we're speaking, please feel free to drop things into the chat or the agenda.
Indeed, I dropped these in while you were chatting. Hi, I'm Brad Cox, the founder of College Autism Network. So I want to share with you one piece of research that I was directly a part of and one that I was not. The first one, if you click on the link I suppose I could probably come up and copy the link here. Look at that, I'm going to do it right now. In the chat, I'm going to paste the link directly to the summary report from a recent study that I did with a few students. And it was essentially, we got a nationally representative group of 60 institutions that have autism-specific college support programs. And we ask for information, basically what happens. So who are these programs? What do they do? And you'll see the kind of summary report. We'll of course be writing it up for journal publication in the not too distant future, but you can get an overview of those results and a quick highlight from there that we knew some of these things cost money. We were surprised at how expensive the ones that did cost money, just how expensive they were. At the same time, we were pleased that I think it was 21 out of the 60 programs didn't cost a dime. for students, which we were pretty excited about in terms of facilitating access. The second piece I wanted to put in there, and I'll just put the link to the DOI in the chat here, is an article, and, and Julie, sorry, I don't mean to pander quite so badly, but actually published in Autism. And I think this came out online first quite a while ago, but it got updated in my EndNote. No, it's brand new. The relationship between social experience and subjective well-being in autistic college students. It got updated in my EndNote recently anyway, so I took another look at it, but I'm a real fan of it, in part because it was truly a mixed method, or at least a multi-method study, rather than simply interviews or simply stats, that they were able to connect the insights from both pieces to create a kind of more rich discussion of what was there. So those are the two I got.
Thank you, Brad. If others want to add some additional articles or resources, please feel free to do so. I do want to point out that Patrick has dropped into, oh, please go ahead. I'm not sure if I heard someone contribute. I was going to say in the chat, you might see that Patrick has dropped in a link about the Virtual Neurodiversity Summit at UC Davis on November 20th. So it seems like that there's going to be a lot of programming related to participatory research, K-12 education, etc. And it's free, which is appealing as well. So thank you, Patrick, for incorporating that, and we will put that in the meeting minutes as well. At this point, are there other folks who want to share resources?
Hi, Brett. It's Jess Monahan from the University of Delaware. I was typing something and I realized I'm just going to say it because it will be faster. So a group of programs and I recently sent out a survey to autistic college students across the country related to COVID and their anxieties with the return to campus. So we're working on creating a PDF to kind of disseminate that information as quickly as possible. But we are also submitting it to a special issue on COVID. So as soon as that's available, I can share it with everybody.
Great, Jess. Thank you very much.
Jess, thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I think the mic was on. A little bit of feedback there. No worries. All right. Well, if other folks over the course of the meeting today, if you'd like to drop something in to the chat, feel free to do so. At this point, we're going to turn it over to our featured presenter, Dr. Julie Lounds Taylor, who is an associate professor of pediatrics and psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and the principal investigator of the Transitions Lab at Vanderbilt University. Main focus today is on her work as an editor of Autism, the International Journal of Research and Practice. Many of you are probably familiar with it. Certainly Brad is having incorporated an article just a few minutes ago. It's really one of the most renowned autism-focused journals, and there is literature that is incorporated in there that pertains to post-secondary education. As what we try to always do with our Canvas presentations and having a mix of topics, different domains of autism represented, one thing that we really want to be mindful of is just helping folks out in terms of knowing what resources to consult, and ultimately, if those of you who are researchers or scholar practitioners and want to publish or want to know more about the publishing process, to have those avenues. So we're really thrilled and honored to have Julie here today to answer questions, share a little bit of context of the publication process, and hopefully engage in a viable dialogue. Over the course of Julie's remarks, please feel free to start adding some comments and questions, because there is going to be a formal Q&A component integrated into this. So at this point, Julie, it is yours.
All right. Well, Brett, thank you so much for having me come and talk a little bit today. It's been nice to see faces of authors and on this call already that have submitted to the journal, as well as faces of people who I have hounded for reviews. There are a lot of people on this call who have been, I think, really accommodating and lovely reviewers for the journal. And of course, like any journal, the quality of the papers that go in and our ability to publish papers depends on that. So I don't know that we say this enough as editors, but we really, 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 really appreciate the reviewers. We know everybody's doing this on top of everything else they have going on. And it is not unnoticed. We do really appreciate it a lot. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. You're not probably seeing the slideshow. I should be better at this by now, let me say. Are you seeing sort of the whole screen with this? Are you just seeing the slideshow itself?
We're seeing the whole screen with like the notes and the layout on the left-hand side.
Well, let me see if I can move the faces panel around so that you're seeing the slideshow.
So where it says monitor, oh, there you got it. Cool. Never
Yay!
mind.
I'm telling you, I'm getting really good at this. So as we all are, the only thing that I'm not figuring out how to see is the chat. Oh, let me see if I can. Okay. So now I've got the chat down here on the bottom. But I may just, I'll try to answer things as I go in the chat if I see them, but I'm also A-okay if you guys just want to interrupt me. If you have questions as you go, I can see the faces on the side here, but I don't have that much to present because I really wanted to make sure that we had lots and lots of time at the end to just answer questions and kind of give whatever sort of feedback or things that I've learned as I've been feeling my way through the editorial process here. So I'm going to talk about some of the insights on the editorial process, and this is really stemming specifically from my experiences at Autism. So there are two pieces of that. One is that this is the process at Autism, right? So it's not necessarily going to be the same at every journal, although there'll be some similarities. And then the other piece is that these are my experiences. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, our editorial team and our team of editors really, we communicate actually quite a lot and try to be very consistent as much as we can across editors in terms of the decisions that we make and when we do sort of the different pieces that I'm going to talk about here. But there are going to be some things that I'm going to talk about that may be unique to kind of my experience as an editor too. So just keep that in mind. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from a really, really nice blog post by Sue Fletcher Watson. So she is the newest editor in the Autism team. She's been an editor for, I think, about a year now, maybe a little bit longer at this point. I feel like I cannot keep track of time anymore at all. All the days run together, right? So maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 1 year, but it's been at least a year. And she wrote this, I think, really, really lovely blog post about kind of her experiences as an editor, really attempting to kind of demystify the process and give tips for people who, not only for reviewers, but for people who are wanting to publish their work in autism. So I've pulled a lot from that. I've also put in some of my own insights and things, but just know that if anybody wants some more information, I think she did a really nice job on this blog post about kind of talking about the process at Autism here. So I'm going to spend just a moment here talking a little bit about how I got to be an editor at Autism and my path to get there. And then I'm going to spend probably more time just sort of talking through kind of, at least from the editor's perspective, what the process looks like from manuscript submission through manuscript acceptance or rejection through decision. And sprinkled throughout that, I've added some tips and things that I've noticed and learned, and also things that we've talked with amongst the editorial team about just tips to make the process go smoother and tips to help you put your best foot forward as you're submitting manuscripts to Autism. I wanted to spend a little bit of time. I was thinking that there will probably be people on this call who might be interested in thinking about trying to get on editorial boards and things like that. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how we make that decision for Autism. And then, of course, leave plenty of time at the end to just have a discussion and questions and things like that. So that's kind of my plan. And so sort of my path to editorship is probably similar to, I think, how this goes for a lot of people. So Autism had been a journal that I had been reviewing for pretty regularly for quite a while, really since the start of my career. I had gotten some advice pretty early on that, you know, if there are journals that I'm really interested in sort of trying to get on the boards for or different things, that those are the journals I should really be thinking about trying to accept reviews for those journals as much as possible, especially if they're in, you know, my area of expertise. So Autism was one of the journals that I thought is really publishing a lot of the work that's relevant to the things that I'm interested in. So I was reviewing for them quite a bit, pretty much since the start of my career, since my postdoc, really. And then in 2015, really 2014, I was asked to co-edit a special issue on autism in adulthood with Patricia Howland, which was a real honor for anybody who does adult issues. Most of you here who are thinking about college, she really is sort of like the first person to be thinking about autism in adults and really trying to understand what happens when children on the autism spectrum grow up to become adults on the autism spectrum. So it was a real honor to be able to co-edit the special issue with her. And that was sort of my first experience getting more involved in the editorial process in autism. I should also say on a side note, I've apologized to Pat later on in the process. So I think I was the much more junior person at the time. And I think the expectation is that I would probably be doing quite a lot of the work. But the manuscripts came in right after I gave birth to my second child. And so, you know, I think probably Pat ended up shouldering more of the burden for the special issue than maybe she had hoped to. But she was a wonderful, wonderful collaborator. I did the very best that I could, and it was a really nice experience to be able to do that. After that experience, I was asked to join the larger editorial board. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but really it just means that you know, as somebody on the editorial board, you're somebody that the editors feel like they can rely on at least a little bit more than sort of otherwise, to hopefully say yes to reviews if something comes up in their topic area. But we also choose people for the editorial board that have given us like really thorough, fair, careful reviews, which is also really important. If you get a couple reviews back and they are either like really harsh or really, really not critical at all, then, you know, that doesn't give you much to go on as an editor. So I'll talk a little bit more about the editorial board, but I was asked to join the editorial board, served on it for 2 years, and then was asked to become an editor of the journal in 2017. I think a lot of that was because the autism was getting more and more content in about adulthood, issues of transition to adulthood, and really wanted to add some more people to the editorial board who could really confidently field those papers. So that's been my path, and then I've been an editor since 2017. I think we serve 3-year terms. It's 3 or 4, I can't remember. So, and you can re-up that. So I'll probably do another term. We'll see, but that would be my plan. So I'm going to kind of go through the steps, and obviously everybody here knows what these steps look like from your end. When you submit a manuscript, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like from my end, from the editorial perspective. So of course, the first thing that you do is submit your manuscript, right, on the online portal. And what happens for autism is once that manuscript comes in, it's reviewed by the editor-in-chief and then assigned to an editor. And most often, David Mandel, who's the editor-in-chief, will try to assign those to whichever editor he feels like has the most expertise in that area. But that's not always the case. And so there may, you know, a manuscript may come in that really is in an area that's a little bit more obscure, that nobody is sort of has a lot of expertise in. Or sometimes if somebody has just gotten a big dump of journals in their queue, of articles in their queue recently, then he may hold off sending a few more to let that editor get caught up a little bit. But in general, it's going to go to the editor that has the most expertise in that area. At that point, sometimes this happens administratively, and sometimes this happens from the perspective of the editor. And I'll do this if I catch it. But the manuscript might get sent back at this point, especially if there are blinding issues that are detected. You know, blinding is tricky these days. I mean, oftentimes you can figure out to some extent where things are coming from. But we still try to keep things blinded as much as possible. I know it's a fine line. If there's, you know, if someone's published a really seminal paper that is critical for somebody to understand, to get what this paper is about, you don't really want to blind that. And so I try not to take like a super, super strict view of blinding, but if there are places where somebody could take out information about exactly where they are or things, I may send a manuscript back for that. I'll also oftentimes send a manuscript back if the word count is really egregiously exceeded. If it's a little bit exceeded, again, I may let it go, and we may work with that a little bit more if the manuscript gets to the next step. But I feel like if somebody has, you know, thousands of extra words to make their case and somebody else doesn't, that puts people on unequal footing. And so if there's a manuscript that really is significantly over the word limit, I may send it back at that point. I'll look at the cover letter when that gets submitted. I don't read it very closely. I may peek at it, and every once in a while there could be information in there that jumps out that makes me think, makes me do something different with the manuscript than I might have otherwise, but I would say that rarely happens. It rarely influences the process. What does influence the process is who authors put in as reviewers. So I think pretty much most journals now, when you submit a manuscript, it'll ask you to put in a handful of potential reviewers. And I think it really behooves authors to think really carefully about this. More so, I think, than, to be honest, than I had thought about these things when I was submitting manuscripts prior to being an editor. So when they ask for you, you've gone through the whole process, you've reformatted your manuscript, probably 2 or 3 things have happened as you've been trying to upload it. I'm always trying to upload my manuscripts at the end of the day, so I'm trying to get home. And then like one of the last steps is, now you need to give us information and contact information for potential reviewers. And I have certainly blown that off in the past. But as an editor, it's really, really helpful. It's really helpful, especially if it is the right kind of reviewer. So it's really important that you pick people who have expertise in the specific area that you are trying to publish in. You guys would be surprised how often for reviewers, somebody will put in like Kathy Lord, or that's just an example, because she's like one of the most well-known autism researchers, right? And a lovely person, and also does review for us. But like people will sort of put in really, really names of people who have really, really general autism expertise, maybe a really well-known, early intervention researcher for an adulthood paper. And I'm probably not going to ask that person to actually review the adulthood paper. The other thing that happens a lot is people will put in names of other editors as potential reviewers. And that's tricky because we have other, if you're submitting a mental health paper, for example, in adulthood, we have Will Mandy on our editorial board, who's one of the world's experts in mental health in adults on the autism spectrum. But I'm not gonna, he's got his own slate of papers that he's dealing with here. So I'm not gonna ask him to review that paper. And similarly, if you're putting in a paper on employment or post-secondary education or adult issues, it really doesn't behoove you to put me as a reviewer for that, because the other, it's not gonna go, well, it's either gonna go to me as the editor, or one of the other reviewers is not gonna ask, one of the other editors is not gonna ask me to review it. So that's basically, at least in terms of being functionally helpful, it's not. So, just be really thoughtful about that. If it's somebody who's sort of has really general autism expertise, somebody who is a very, very senior person who's really not reviewing much these days anyway, or another editor, it's not going to be very helpful. And the reason why it's important to do this is I'm telling you, it can speed your review process. You can cut your review time down by half, at least, if not more, from the time that you submit your manuscript to the time that you get your decision, if we can get good reviewers for that manuscript quickly. That is the thing that, especially nowadays during COVID, that holds up manuscripts more than just about anything else. So if you can give us great names of reviewers that we can look them up if we don't know them and say, wow, they really do have expertise in this area, and they're people who you think have a pretty good likelihood of saying yes to the review, I'm telling you, it fast tracks your manuscript. We ask for reviews in 3 weeks. And most reviewers get pretty close to that within a month, I would say. But yeah, a lot of you have probably noticed that you don't get your decisions for 2 months, if not longer. And the vast majority of that extra time is finding reviewers. So you can really, really, really help that out by giving us good potential reviewers. So I can't emphasize that enough. It makes it easier for us, but it makes it go so much faster for you if that's the case. And at least before I was an editor, I really blew off that part of the submission process. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox there. Okay, so the next piece that I think really differs a lot from journal to journal is whether the manuscript gets sent out for peer review. So the next piece, so we get the manuscript in, I look it over and decide whether it needs to go back to the authors or not, whether it's too long, or, I start to look through getting some ideas for who the reviewers might be. But the next thing that I'll do is, at this point, usually I read over the whole entire manuscript to try to decide whether I'm going to send it out for external review or not. So at Autism, especially in the past year or so, we get a lot of manuscripts in. I would say I alone get assigned probably 4 manuscripts each week, and we've got 6 different editors. And so it's a big load, and it's a big load to manage, and it's a big load to find reviewers for, especially if it's important to get good reviewers, right, who know the area well. In Autism also, I'll come back to this too, we take right now less than 15% of the manuscripts that we get. It's a pretty small number. And so we as editors have been trying to take a pretty active role in deciding whether to send something out for review or not. And I think there are lots of good reasons to do this. One is that, if your manuscript doesn't get sent out for peer review, you can very quickly turn it around and send it someplace else. So you're not sitting through the 2 to 3 month process. You get it back ideally within 2 weeks. I try to get to those as quickly as I can on my end. And then you can move on to the next place. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute in the desk reject, but that sort of is the next step. Is I read over the manuscript and I decide whether to send it out for peer review. If we do decide to send it out for peer review, at Autism, we typically get 2 reviewers for each manuscript. Other journals do more. I've gotten some reviews back sometimes where you may get like 4 or 5 reviewers for a given manuscript. Not from Autism, from other places. We really try very, very hard to stick with 2. We do that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's just a lot easier to manage as an author. It's a lot easier to manage as a reviewer. And I would say the vast majority of the time, the reviews actually line up really well. And then that makes the decision easy. Now, sometimes when you only get 2 reviews back, you can get really disparate reviews where somebody says minor revisions and somebody says reject. And then as the editor, you have to figure out what to do with that and spend a lot of time with that. But that doesn't actually happen that often. Usually 2 reviews are enough for me as an editor to feel confident, along with sort of my own reading of the manuscript with what's going on. And to find reviewers, again, I'm as much as I can, I love trying to go off the reviewers that authors send. Sometimes you can use those and sometimes you can't. So when you can't, I'll look at the reference lists in the manuscripts, I'll look at keywords, and I'll definitely rely on editorial board members if there's somebody who is not currently reviewing a manuscript for Autism and has expertise in that area. I've already alluded to this. For some manuscripts, finding 2 reviewers happens really quickly. I'll send something out to 2 people and they'll both respond right away and say that they can do it. That is not the norm. and sometimes it can take a really long time. In the way that we do this in the Autism system, and just so you can understand, I think as authors, how this works, is you can invite 2 reviewers and then you can actually set up a whole list of alternate reviewers. So what the system does then is as soon as one of the 2 reviewers that you set up turns the review down, it automatically moves to the next one on the list. I don't have to do a thing. Immediately when that comes in, it'll move to the next reviewer. So the downside of that is that it can't move to the next reviewer until the person has turned down the manuscript, right? And so this is the other tip, at least in terms of reviewers for Autism. If you can't review, it is so helpful, again, to just respond back to that invitation as soon as you possibly can, so the system can move on to the next potential reviewer. Like let's say it takes me contacting 8 people before we can find 2 reviewers, and that is not uncommon. I've had some manuscripts that have been many more than that. If you think about it, if everybody has a week to 2 to respond to and we have to wait for every single person who takes that week or 2 to respond before we move to the next, right? It can take a really long time. So sometimes I'll put in 3 reviewers right from the start, just in case, but then you do run the risk that all 3 of them say yes, and now you end up with 3 reviews instead of 2. So I try to balance that. But just from the reviewer perspective, I think if you can't do it, that's okay. Just say no as fast as you can, and then we can keep moving on. The other thing that I don't have here that is so helpful, if you can't review, if you can send names of people who have good expertise, you can. I'm telling you, I like that almost as much as saying yes. I mean, it is so cool. It's really, really helpful too. So that just moves everything along more quickly for everybody. Let me see. I feel like I might have seen some things in chat. Let me stop and take a peek. Let's see. Stay within the word count. 2 months is great. Oh, Brad, 10 months? I think you're muted, or I can't hear you at least.
Oh, yeah, that's generally my default. People don't want to hear me. Yeah, no, it took us, it was about right, Brett, right? I'm not lying about that. 9-10 months, yeah. And it was a positive decision, but yeah, our first decision took 10 months, and it was 2 years from submission to actual publication. Yeah, so thanks for 2 months. It's good.
We really shoot for that. And I think if you look, I would say they tell us that our average time to decision is like 43 days, but that takes into account desk rejects, right? So it puts it all together, and that's a little bit of apples and oranges. But I would say, for the most part, we can usually get decisions out in 2 months. But it really depends on and I can stay pretty on top of when things come back in to make the decision usually within a couple days. So it's really this beginning part of getting reviewers that can really drag the process down. But good, I'm glad that people are generally happy with 2 months, because that's about, for the most part, where we end up, I think. 3 months tends to be the longest. And if I have a manuscript that's been sitting for 3 months, that's when I start to really start to hound the reviewers a little bit more to say, hey guys, when do you think you're going to get me this review? Okay, let's see. Uh-oh, I'm not moving forward now. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the desk reject, because I think that Autism probably uses this a little bit more judiciously than some other disability journals in particular. I would say not more than sort of other more general journals that I've submitted. I have had many more manuscripts desk rejected from more general journals than I have sent out for review, for sure. But I don't feel like that's something that happens as much, at least in disability journals. So just want to talk a little bit more about that. So at Autism, again, we are able to accept less than 15% of all the manuscripts that we get in. And again, like I mentioned before, the reason why we desk reject is for a couple of reasons. One is to get the feedback back to the authors really quickly. We don't want to exhaust our pretty limited, relatively limited reviewer pool for manuscripts that we think are probably unlikely to get published at the end of the day. So what would lead me to desk reject a manuscript? And I would say this is not just me. So when we make desk rejections as an Autism editorial team, if we feel any sort of, if we feel unsure about it, we'll do one of two things. If we feel unsure, what we may do is just send it out for review anyway and see what the reviewers say. That happens quite a lot, actually. The other thing that we'll do if we feel unsure is we'll send it to the others on the editorial team and say, kind of, here's what I'm thinking, but what would you guys do here? Are you missing this? So we really try to be careful when we desk reject. And so the reasons why I would desk reject, and I say this is, and again, this is pretty consistent with others given my experiences, is if kind of in my first read of this manuscript, I really see some pretty significant issues with the study design, the analyses, or the conclusions. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but like, let's say you have a control group, you're really interested in an autism versus control group, and your control group is really not well matched to your autism group. Well, then you don't know if it's autism or if it's a number of other things that could be driving differences. It's just sort of one obvious thing that I might notice on the front end. Another thing that I might notice on the front end would be like, if you had really small samples and it was a quantitative study and all of your findings were not statistically significant, and so then you're kind of drawing conclusions about lack of differences between your groups, but in reality, you're probably underpowered to see them even if they were there. So some things like that I may notice pretty quickly that are sort of significant issues. Another reason why things get desk rejected quite a lot actually is the sort of methodologically, the manuscript might be just fine. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really seem to add to our knowledge of what we know about autism. And that's a pretty common reason why we might desk reject something too. It's just either it's just not clear. And sometimes it is clear, and it's just, well, we've already found this in 3 or 4 other studies, and this doesn't really add anything new. Or sometimes it's just not written in a way to make that clear, and I'm concerned enough about that to not sort of move forward down the road. And the last thing that actually happens a lot less often, but happens from time to time, is major ethical concerns. It happens more often than you might think, that somebody would write and say, well, we didn't really need IRB approval for this study because of A, B, and C. And then I look over the study and I'm like, I don't feel very good about that. And so those are sort of the bigger issues. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end here kind of delving into some more specifics about things that I've seen in my manuscripts that really sort of hold things back from getting published sometimes. So I'll talk a little bit more. And again, these are the things that I've seen and my experiences, so we have to take it with a grain of salt, but I'll get a little bit more specific. Let me also say too, whenever I desk reject a letter, I try really hard to include some text and some notes in the decision letter about why the manuscript isn't getting sent out for review. I think the way that I see it, I mean, there really aren't hardly any manuscripts that come through our desk that I think, wow, this is probably not going to get published. Usually these are things that are going to get published somewhere. And so if I can give a little bit of feedback to help push it in a direction that I think will make it more likely to get published down the road, I'm really happy to do that. And especially if there are specific issues that I can point to, I really like to do that. You know, it gets harder to write something when it says like, this is a good paper, but I just don't know that it contributes to the literature. That sort of is a harder letter to write. And I have to say, if any of you have gotten desk rejects from me and this isn't pulled out, sometimes I just want to get the decision out and I've got a million things going on. And instead of having it sit for a week and having the authors not get their decision letter when I've made the decision to desk reject, sometimes I just get it out so that people can move on, honestly. But I try not to do that. Whenever possible, if I desk reject, I try to give at least a little bit of a reason for why that's the case for that. Let me stop and look at I think there's a little bit in the chat here. Oh yeah, am I running too long, Brett? Do I need to go a little quicker? What is our time looking like?
Yeah, if you could try to wrap up in about 5 minutes, that way we have some time toward questions, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I'll go quickly through the rest here. A lot of it I think I've caught on. Revisions, you know, this is like for any journal, really clearly and carefully address each of the reviewer's concerns. When I can, I'll try to pull out things that I think are particularly important. And then if an editor does that, those are the really, 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 really important things to address. But it's, you know, it's important to address everything. And it can take multiple rounds. If things start to get really close, I may not send it out to the reviewers at the end and just work with the authors directly. And then acceptance is awesome. I love, 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 love accepting manuscripts. I love when manuscripts get to that point. I feel like a lot of times they don't, and I've had enough of my own manuscripts that are rejected from journals that it pains me every time it has to happen, but I'm thrilled when I get to accept a manuscript. So let me talk a minute about this, because I think this is sort of helpful, and then we can kind of delve into this a little bit deeper if anybody wants to. So these are I think when I was sort of reflecting on what happens a lot when manuscripts get rejected, for my experiences at least. And I mentioned the small sample size studies. I do not reject a manuscript for small sample sizes, especially depending on the kind of research that it is, you know. But if it's a small sample size and there are null effects and the sample's just not powered to see anything, that would be a reason for reject. Control groups that are not well matched, I mentioned. We're starting to really take very, very seriously at Autism the inclusion of descriptive information about the sample. Because autism is such a heterogeneous condition, it's really important that we understand who the findings apply to and who they probably don't. And we get a fair number of manuscripts in that really include little to no descriptive information about the sample, actually. So we're really taking that very seriously. Problematic measurement's an issue in a lot of disability research, but if it's really clear that sort of whatever measure people are using is not measuring what they think it is, or if somebody uses a measure that seems problematic and then they find completely counterintuitive findings and then they try to justify those, it's like, well, it could just be your measure. right? And so that's something. Qualitative research, we get a lot of qualitative studies, and I think qualitative studies can be so interesting, but we get quite a few qualitative studies that at the end of the day come to pretty basic conclusions, or conclusions either that we already know or that we've seen in other quantitative studies. And I think we're not leveraging sort of the beauty and the power of qualitative research. So I love qualitative studies that really dig in deeper to tell us new things that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And if they don't, then it may get rejected. We get a lot of reviews of articles, more so than I would have thought. And I like reviews, but again, they have to tell us something new. They have to summarize things in an important way. Even if there aren't that many studies that are reviewed, if it points to directions for future, there has to be like an angle for it, right? Just reviewing something that other people have reviewed is probably not going to get accepted. And again, moving knowledge forward is the key here. So whenever you're submitting a manuscript, you need to make it really clear what the study adds, but also don't oversell it, because we'll also see that too. So really finding the fine line between showing what gap this fills and how this moves our knowledge forward, while still being really sober about that, is important. And something that happens a lot that I just want to mention so it's clear, at least in autism, we have decided as an editorial team that studies of autistic traits within the general population are outside of the scope of what we publish. And we get these papers from time to time using like the BAPQ, using the AQ, different measures that are kind of looking at like the general population of college students or whatever, and then saying like autism traits on this sort of continuous scale and looking at how that correlates with things. We've decided that, like, at least for the journal Autism, we're really interested in research that's focused on autistic individuals themselves and not people in the general population who have higher or lower values of autistic traits. There are lots of other autism journals that will take those kinds of papers for sure, good autism journals, but that's outside of the scope of what we do. Appealing the decision, that is something that can be done. So I wanted to say just a word about that. I will say it's not often that successful because we are really careful when we make decisions. But when it is successful, oftentimes it's because there was a reviewer who just really didn't understand the project, and it might be something that was outside of the expertise of the editor, so they rely on the reviewer, and maybe the reviewer was really off. So I think if you get a review back that just feels very off, I think it's fine to appeal, and I never feel negatively about somebody who appeals a decision. I feel like I can always get it wrong, but use it judiciously and sparingly, I think, in cases where you really feel like somebody really missed the boat. I'm just going to jump past joining the editorial board so we have time for questions and answers. If you want to join the editorial board, review for autism and do careful reviews. We keep track of that. And yearly, we look at the statistics to decide who is reviewing for us and who's doing a really nice job and who has expertise in content areas that we need. So we really do look at that in terms of making the decisions for the editorial board. I think I've already talked about a lot of being a helpful reviewer. So we'll just go right to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Julie. All right, so this is a great time again for folks to pop in questions into the chat. Looks like the first one comes from Caden, who asks, if you get a desk reject without any details as to why in the decision letter, is it appropriate to follow up and ask?
Yeah, I would say so. And it's hard because sometimes if there are lots and lots of reasons why it's desk rejected, it's, I'll sit down and spend some more time thinking about that, where I might not as much. So I guess the other thing to think about with a desk reject or with any is I may pull out sort of a handful of the biggest reasons in my letter, but if you can like rebut each of those usually aren't the only reasons, if that makes sense. So if I guess if the editor, if someone pulls out one or two things, those are sort of some of the bigger things, not necessarily all the things that drove the decision, but I would say, yes, I think if you get a desk reject back, you don't get any comments. And especially if you're thinking about making change, if you think you're just going to turn it around and send it someplace else without making any changes, then I would say it's probably not worth asking for a follow-up. But if you're actually thinking about sitting down with it and making some changes, then yeah, I would ask the editor why the manuscript got a desk reject. Does that make sense? If you're going to use the information, I would ask it. If you are going to kind of just turn it around, then it's maybe less helpful.
Great question, Caden. next question comes from Laura, who asks, when you see that someone has expertise in an area and has been reviewing for you or giving good reviews, do you reach out to them? Or is it ever worthwhile to just ask about joining an editorial board?
Yeah, I would say yes and yes. So once a year, we review all of the journal reviewing stats for the not just for the actually we do it for the editorial board. And if there are people on the board who have turned down lots and lots and lots, who like haven't reviewed for us in the past couple of years, then oftentimes we may ask them to step off. And if there are people who have reviewed a lot for us, and I think typically it's been maybe like 6 I'm giving like a spitball number here, but like maybe 6 or 7 manuscripts over the course of a year. So that's quite a lot, right? And they're not on the editorial board, then we would decide to invite them. So we go directly based on the statistics of reviews and the reviewers. But I do say we do get requests sometimes from people who ask if there might be a spot or if it might be possible for them to join the editorial board. And then we will consider that, but we base the decision explicitly on their review history. So, so if you feel like you've reviewed a lot and you feel like nobody's reaching out to you and it's something that you're interested in, then I think asking is appropriate. If you'd like to be on the editorial board and you haven't reviewed very much, the next step for sure is to just, as requests come in, to just start taking those whenever you can.
Fantastic. We'll probably have time for a few more questions, so if folks want to put into the chat or speak up, this might be about your last opportunity to do that in the interest of time. We do have a question from Shiva, who says fantastic presentation, and other complimentary remarks. 2 questions here include, what percentage of articles that you receive or review focus on culturally and linguistically diverse individuals on the autism spectrum, or participant pools that include autistic individuals from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds? Second question is, what are some changes and trends you are seeing or have been seeing over the years in terms of the articles that you receive, or in terms of design trends as well?
Yep. So in terms of the percentage of articles, I think we all probably know the answer to this, and it is all too low. I mean, and this is a problem with autism research in general, is we're just not seeing the amount of research that we need in culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And I would argue, because autism is an international journal, the vast majority of what we publish comes from a small handful of nations. And so even kind of what autism looks like internationally, we don't get that many. And when we get manuscripts in that focus on these other types of groups, I do have to say, I will give them additional consideration. Now, if I see some significant issues with the methods or with the conclusions or things like that, that's being from sort of an underrepresented group is not going to override that. But I will certainly spend a lot of time on those manuscripts before I make that decision, because I know if the research, if we can sort of shape it, I'll even sometimes work with authors actually, if we can work together to shape it into something that can ultimately be publishable in autism and it's a real huge hole in the field, then that's something that will happen from time to time. In terms of trends and topics, we see more and more adult work. We're seeing a lot of transition to adulthood and a lot of adult work. There's, I think, interesting work going on that we're seeing more of around like sexuality issues that I think are really important. I think just really looking at the range of issues in transition to adulthood and adulthood outside of just like work. I think we've seen studies on work for a while, and those studies are really important, and I do some of those studies, but we're really seeing people thinking about things like menopause and issues of sexuality and health and thinking about really autism more broadly. And we're seeing a lot of studies that are coming in that are including the perspectives of individuals on the autism spectrum into the research, a lot more so than we used to, and I think that's a really nice addition. So I would say that's a trend in design, is studies that are more participatory. Yeah, so that's probably mostly it.
Great. Well, I think we're probably going to wrap up at this point, but I certainly encourage folks to email you, Julie, if they have subsequent questions. This is all really helpful information, and I know I certainly enjoyed it as well. great to have you all on for our October 2020 Canvas meeting. A link to this recording will be available after this week, so expect that in your inbox along with meeting minutes and other information, including details of our next meeting in November. So it'll be a little bit after the summit. It'll be Thursday, November 12th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, so just a little bit later than today, with Dr. Shel Whitman from the University of Illinois at Chicago, who is going to discuss research related to parental participation, try saying that a few times fast, in the post-secondary education of students with autism spectrum disorder. And many of you know Cheryl has been a huge member in our Canvas community, so we'll be glad to learn more about her work in that space. Wishing you all a good rest of the week. We look forward to seeing many of you at the College Autism Summit in just a couple of weeks. We promoted this to no end, and we're really excited about it as we're getting down to the wire, and we'll have a lot of great content to share both in that context and certainly us following it, sharing our reflections and seeking your input ultimately too, which is very valuable. So at this point, we wish you all a good rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you participate even more in our Canvas listserv and next month at our Canvas meeting. So take care, everybody.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Julie.